He listened quietly and he learned, which gave him a rich and a varied knowledge of, well, just about everything.
William Floyd.
William Floyd.
William Floyd.
William Floyd, the first delegate from New York to sign the Declaration of Independence, was born on December 17, 1734 in Long Island, New York. William's father was a respectable landholder and planter, and he died when William was very, very young, leaving him with the family's estate and the land holdings. Since William lost his father so early, his formal education was limited. But young William learned through experience and built many relationships with powerful people in his community. His acquaintances admired him. Though he rarely took part in public discussions, he would listen quietly and learn, which gave him a rich and a varied knowledge of just about everything. He didn't depend on other people for his answers. His views were his own. His opinions were a result and reason and reflection. Once his mind was made up, he didn't often change his mind. His firmness and his resolution are rarely equaled. If he disagreed with someone, his kindness and his integrity kept their friendship intact. As a quiet, charismatic gentleman, it is no surprise that William would have no trouble finding a wife. And he married Hannah Jones in 1769, and they had 3 children together. 12 years into their marriage, Hannah died, leaving William to raise their kids. William was then married to Joanna Strong, who would bring him 2 more children. William felt strongly about the rights of the colonies, and this led to his appointment as the delegate from New York at the First Continental Congress from 1774 to 1776, where he was able to sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, at the age of 41. William assisted in the severing of the political bands between the colonies and the British government by serving on numerous important committees to the patriotic cause. In 1777, he was appointed a senator of the state of New York. During this time, he organized the government. In 1778, he was again elected to represent the state of New York in the Continental Congress. From this time until the expiration of the First Congress, he was either a member of the National Assembly or a member of the Senate, and often presided over its deliberations when the lieutenant governor left its chair. The effects of war often involved people's families and their properties. Both were greatly affected in the Floyd family. When the American troops evacuated Long Island, his family went to Connecticut for safety, abandoning the family estate. His home was occupied by a company of British horsemen almost for 7 years, who caused a great deal of damage to his property. After returning to his estate and finding the state that it was in, William purchased a tract of land on the Mohawk River in 1784 to start building his retirement home on. He spent his summers building and developing the land, and finally, in 1803, William permanently moved in, after having served his country faithfully for over 15 years. William enjoyed excellent health until a year or 2 before his death. His mind was clear and active, unimpaired right to the very end, which was probably helped by the work that he was doing and putting into his second homestead so late in his life. His death occurred on the 4th of August, 1821, at the extraordinary age of 87 years old. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of William, "In his person, General Floyd was of a middle stature. He possessed a natural dignity, which seldom failed to impress those into whose company he was thrown. He appeared to enjoy the pleasures of private life, yet in his manners he was less familiar, and in his disposition less affable than most men. Few men, however, were more respected. William is a great example of how to disagree without being disagreeable. Philip Livingston's passion and enthusiasm and excellent education made his business as a merchant quite profitable.
Philip Livingston.
Philip Livingston.
Philip Livingston.
Philip Livingston was born on January 15, 1716 in Albany, New York, to a family with generations of highly respected citizens. He was tutored at home and graduated from Yale College in 1737. After graduation, Philip went into business as a merchant, which was quite a popular profession at the time. Well, with his passion and enthusiasm and excellent education, his business became quite profitable. He personally felt the effects of and despised British taxes, but he opposed any types of violent acts and dreaded war. Well, with his business booming and his future secured, Philip was able to find his future wife, Christina ten Baroque. The pair of lovebirds went on and got married April 14th, 1740, and had 9 children together. In 1754, Philip was elected an alderman in New York. That's an elected member of a municipal council, next in status to the mayor. This was his first appearance into public life, and he remained in this important and respectable office for the next 9 years. The colony of New York, for a time, was more under the influence of the British Crown than any of the other colonies, and they more slowly accepted the idea of a revolution. But all along, there were those individuals in that colony that possessed a more patriotic spirit or more ready to rise in opposition to British aggression. When the British began to oppress the colonies, no one gave stronger opposition than Mr. Livingston. He despised the power that the British government had over the colonies. He was willing to put up with the British authority as long as it was limited, and it had a reason, and justice approved it. He favored the rights of the colonies, and that made him the perfect person to represent the colony in the Congress of 1774. Philip was a member of the 1776 Congress and was able to cast his vote in favor of the American independence. On the 4th of July, 1776, Philip was able to sign the Declaration of Independence at the age of 60. The Constitution of the State of New York was adopted the following year, April 20th, 1777. Under this Constitution, Mr. Livingston was chosen as a senator for the Southern District, and he attended the first meeting of the first legislature of the state of New York. In October, an election took place for the members of Congress, and Mr. Livingston, of course, was chosen. This was a critical and a gloomy period in the history of the Revolution. The British had taken possession of Philadelphia, forcing the Congress to retire from that city. They had agreed to hold a session at York. The health of Mr. Livingston was very serious. He had dropsy in the chest, which basically is congestive heart failure, with no chance of recovery. He was daily pulled out of his active life to deal with his condition. Yet his love for his country continued strong and unwavering. With his family in Kingston, where they had been forced to flee to escape the British Army, Philip had traveled to fulfill his position in the Continental Congress. As he left them for the last time, he bid a bittersweet goodbye, predicting that he would not make it home ever again. Although he didn't get to spend his last days at home, he was kept company by his son Henry, who was at that time a member of General Washington's family. After hearing of the illness of his father, Henry hurried to be with his dying parent. These sad predictions did prove to be accurate and true, and on June 12th, 1778, he passed away while serving in the Congress at the age of 62. On the day of his death, it was announced in the Hall of Congress, and the following resolutions were adopted. Resolved, that Congress will in a body attend the funeral this evening at 6 o'clock with a crape around the arm, and will continue in mourning for the space of 1 month. Now, the crape around the arm was a mark of mourning, but usually only worn by servants. This was an outward sign of respect by the Congress to maintain the memory of a dearly departed loved one. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Philip, "Mr. Livingston is said to have been naturally silent and reserved, and to strangers to have appeared austere. Yet he was uncommonly mild and affectionate to his family and his friends. He was a firm believer in the great truths of the Christian system, and a sincere and a humble follower of the divine Redeemer." Philip Livingston's passion and enthusiasm in his excellent education served him well his whole life. He literally gave heart and soul to his country. With no commander, no protection, and no ammunition, the 1,400 men surrendered as prisoners of war.
Francis Lewis.
Francis Lewis.
Francis Lewis.
Francis Lewis was born in 1713 in Llandaff, Wales, to a loving family. When Francis was about 4 or 5 years old, both of his parents died, leaving him an orphan. Fortunately, he was left in the care of his aunt, who made sure he had a good education. After graduating from Westminster, Francis worked in the counting room of a merchant in London. Since he ultimately wanted to go into business for himself, Francis learned everything that he could and eventually was able to become a merchant himself. After inheriting some property from his family's estate at the age of 21, Francis sailed for New York, arriving in 1735, and set up his business with the help of Edward Ansley, who he had previously done business with. After a few years, Francis married Edward's sister, Elizabeth Ansley, in 1745, and the pair would go on to have 7 children together. However, only 3 survived to adulthood. Francis was an excellent merchant. He was an agent for supplying British troops during the French or Canadian War. Francis was there when British Colonel Mercy was attacked by more than 5,000 Europeans, Canadians, and Indians on August 10th. 3 days later, Colonel Mercy was killed while standing right next to Mr. Lewis. Well, with no commander, no protection, and no ammunition, the 1,400 men surrendered as prisoners of war. Upon surrendering, they were promised kind treatment. Well, that didn't happen. The Indians selected about 30 prisoners and were allowed to do whatever they wanted with them. Mr. Lewis was one of those 30 people. A speedy, cruel death was what was expected, but Mr. Lewis was somehow spared, and he was eventually sent as a prisoner of war to France, and sometimes afterwards was exchanged and returned back to America. The services that were given by Mr. Lewis during that war were so valuable to the British government, they gave him 5,000 acres of land. That's about 8 square miles of land. Even though he was not born in America, his independent and patriotic spirit brought him to be one of the Sons of Liberty. He despised the Stamp Act and British taxes, which pushed Francis to pursue a political career. He was unanimously elected in 1775 to the Continental Congress. During this time, he was particularly useful in the purchase of provisions and clothing for the army, bringing in arms and munitions, and many, many other transactions where he used his merchant skills. Well, just 1 year after joining the Congress, Francis was able to sign the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of about 63. Well, just 1 year prior, in 1775, Mr. Lewis had moved his family to Long Island. Well, that turned out to be a great big mistake, because in the fall of 1776, his house was destroyed by the British. His library, his valuable papers were all destroyed, but they weren't satisfied just to ruin his property. They wanted revenge for his signature on the Declaration of Independence. His wife Elizabeth fell prisoner to them for several months. In November of 1776, the attention of Congress was called to her distressed condition, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't negotiate her release. But through the influence of George Washington, Mrs. Lewis was eventually released. But the injuries she sustained during her imprisonment caused her death in 1778. There's little known about Mr. Lewis after this point. From this point on, his days were spent in poverty, his self-made fortune having been sacrificed to his country during the struggle for independence. Francis Lewis finally passed away December 30th, 1803, at the age of 90. Reverend Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of him, Mr. Lewis was distinguished for a becoming zeal in the cause of liberty, tempered by the influence of a correct judgment and a cautious prudence. Francis was born to a loving family in Wales, orphaned at the age of 4 or 5, educated and worked as a merchant in London, sailed for New York, supplied the British troops, taken as a prisoner of war, narrowly escaping death, sent as a prisoner to France, exchanged and returned to America, given land in gratitude from the British, provided arms, munitions for the Americans, signed the Declaration of Independence, had his property destroyed by the British, and lost his wife as a prisoner of war. Is this guy for real? He did everything. He was involved in so many countries. He was given gifts and freedom, and then it all got taken away. Plus, he lived to the age of 90. He's amazing. The British Army had landed their ships within cannon shot of the family estate. A signature to the Declaration of Independence would ensure the destruction of that beautiful land.
Lewis Morris.
Lewis Morris.
Lewis Morris.
Lewis Morris was born in Morrisania, New York, in 1726 to a very wealthy family of planters and politicians. Morrisania, which obviously was owned by his family, covered about 2,000 acres or 3 square miles and resembled a small town with farmers and blacksmiths and carpenters and slaves, everything you need. He was the oldest of 4 brothers, all who went on to be very successful. At 16, he attended Yale, where he learned to be a good scholar and a moral man. He was very tall and dignified, generous, graceful, and benevolent. He found his greatest pleasure being at home. In 1749, Lewis married Miss Walton, who also came from a similar prestigious background. The pair went on to have 10 children, 6 sons and 4 daughters. Since he was quite wealthy, Lewis was very content. He did not, however, allow his comfortable situation to prevent him from defending his country. He could not be neutral as the tension in the country grew and grew, and the prospect of war became more and more imminent. He jumped into politics because war was better than surrender of the rights which God had given to the American people. The Congress of 1774 assembled in New York. Mr. Morris was not a member because he was too outspoken and too patriotic to allow differing opinions to be argued. The goal of this Congress was not war, but peace. Well, that goal failed, other than a desire that a compromise might be made between the colonies and the British government. Well, by May 15th, 1775, war was obvious. The Battle of Lexington had opened the war. Strong patriotic men with bold independent spirits were now needed in the Congress, and Mr. Morris was now perfect for the position and, of course, was elected. He was placed on a committee of which Washington was the chairman to devise ways and means to supply the colonies with the munitions and the military supplies. During the winter of 1775 and 76, the subject of the Declaration of Independence began to occupy the minds of many in all parts of the country. New York was particularly reluctant to join the cause because there was a very close relationship between the people of the city and the officers of the royal government. The military officers were close friends to their citizens and had even formed connections with some of the most prominent families there. Well, by giving his vote for the Declaration of Independence, Lewis displayed patriotism that few men were brave enough to show. While this was going on, the British Army had landed their ships within cannon shot of the family estate. A signature to the Declaration of Independence would ensure the destruction of that beautiful land. Lewis was indifferent to the possibility of losing his home and acted in the best interest of his country. He voted for the separation from Britain, and he signed the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of about 50. Soon after, the hostile army demolished the estate at Morrisania. More than 1,000 acres were destroyed. His house was damaged, his fences ruined, his livestock scattered, and his family was forced to leave. Few men during the Revolution were called to make greater sacrifices than Mr. Morris, and none made them more cheerfully. Mr. Morris left Congress in 1777 to serve as a senator to the New York State Senate, where he served on and off until 1790. During this time, Lewis returned to his estate at Morrisania and found it destroyed and looted by the British. Well, Lewis got to work to restore it back to its former glory. Despite his love for the property, Lewis selflessly offered it as the site of the young country's new capital, although Washington, D.C. was chosen instead. Lewis was able to enjoy his hard work during his 8-year retirement until his death in January 22nd, 1798. He was 71 years old. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Lewis, "His person was of lofty stature and of fine proportions, imparting to his presence an uncommon dignity, softened, however, by a disposition unusually generous and benevolent, and by a demeanor so graceful that few men could fail to do him homage." Well, my favorite thing about Lewis Morris is that he was too outspoken and too patriotic to allow any other opinion. They wanted peace, but when the peace failed, they needed the strong, patriotic men with bold, independent spirit, and Mr. Morris was perfect for the position and was elected. When the big guns were needed, they needed him, and I like that. Richard Stockton escaped death from an aggressive robber, a shipwreck, taken prisoner by a mob, dragged from his bed, placed in a common prison where he was starved, beaten, and nearly frozen to death.
Richard Stockton.
Richard Stockton.
Richard Stockton.
Richard Stockton was born on October 1st, 1730, near Princeton, New Jersey. Richard was named after his great-grandfather who came to America in 1670. Richard received a very good education early in his life, graduating with honors from West Nottingham Academy in 1748. Richard devoted himself to the study of law and was admitted to the New Jersey bar at the age of 24. He soon built a good reputation both as a counselor and as an advocate. He was known for his easy and eloquent way of speaking. In about 1757, Richard married the love of his life, Annis Boudinot, who was a poet and the first colonial woman to have her work published. Well, our pair of eloquent scholars went on to have 6 children, 4 daughters, 2 sons. Interesting, their daughter Julia Stockton went on to marry fellow signer Benjamin Rush. In 1766 and 67, Richard left his professional business to go visit England, Scotland, and Ireland. During his tour there, he found that his professional reputation had preceded him, and he was even invited to participate in court by a minister of the king, where he discussed American affairs with many distinguished people from across the pond. While he was visiting in Edinburgh, he was invited to a public dinner by the authorities for his impressive character. His trip there, however, wasn't all fun and games. While he was in Edinburgh, Richard was stopped one night by an aggressive robber. Richard defended himself with a dagger and even wounded his surprised attacker, preventing any loss of property, but the robber got away. Later during the same trip, Richard was planning to cross the Irish Channel and had purchased a ticket to do so. Richard waited, and he waited for his luggage to arrive from the previous leg of his trip, but his luggage didn't show up on time, and the ship he was meant to board had already left. But this ended up saving Richard's life, since that very ship got shipwrecked during a storm, sending everyone on board to a watery grave. In 1768, Richard was appointed to a seat in the New Jersey Provincial Council. He was respected by his superiors in the royal government and had a perfect home life, plenty of money. He was surrounded by the family that he greatly loved, and he held a prestigious position in the most powerful government in the world. But eventually the question arose whether he should or whether he should not continue his allegiance to the king. He happily sacrificed his secure future and separated himself from the royal council. Richard was elected to represent New Jersey in the 1776 Continental Congress and was very active in the discussions there. But he had some doubts about rushing into independence. After hearing the powerful and the impressive speeches from John Adams, his doubts were then gone. Richard was not only convinced of the importance of independence, but addressed the House himself before the close of the debate as a proponent for independence. Richard was able to sign the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of 45. On November 30th, Richard was taken prisoner by a mob of loyalists, dragged from his bed, and forced to march to New York to be placed in a common prison where he was starved, beaten, and nearly frozen to death. Congress told General Washington, and he sent General Howe to go solve the situation. Richard was eventually released, but his health was never to be the same, despite having Benjamin Rush as his son-in-law, closely caring for him. Richard's money, his home and lands, they were ruined. His papers and his library burnt, animals driven away, and he was now dependent on his friends for even the bare necessities of survival. Richard was forced to resign from the Congress as a term of his parole, leaving a hole that was never to be adequately filled by anyone else. And Richard died from lip cancer. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Richard Stockton. In his private life, he was easy and graceful in his manners. In his conversation, affable and entertaining, and master of a smooth and eloquent style, even in his ordinary discourse. As a man of letters, he possessed a superior genius, highly cultivated by long and assiduous application. At his funeral, Dr. Reverend Samuel Smith said, "Before your eyes, a most sensible and affecting remains of a man who hath been long among the foremost of his country for power, for wisdom, and for fortune, whose eloquence only wanting a theater like Athens to have rivaled the Greek and the Roman fame. If many great and personal talents could save a man from the grave, we would not find ourselves here lamenting, "Behold the end of all perfection." How nice would it be to have that said at your funeral? John never spoke until he had written his speeches in secret, perfectly memorized them, and then he could repeat a sermon or a speech verbatim by simply reading it 3 times. He would then present them with clarity and with power.
John Witherspoon.
John Witherspoon.
John Witherspoon.
John Witherspoon was born on February 5th, 1722 in Gifford, Scotland. John's father was a reverend who valued education, so young John was placed in Haddington Grammar School. After learning all that he could there, John then attended the University of Edinburgh at the age of just 14 years old. 5 years later, John finished college and started preaching. He was offered to work with his father and eventually take over his position. But John chose to accept an invitation from the parish of Beath, west of Scotland. During his time in Beath, John met Elizabeth Montgomery, and the pair would get married and go on to have 10 children together, although only 5 survived more than a few years. With the political situation in Scotland in turmoil, and he having been held as a prisoner for a time after losing the Battle of Falkirk, John and Elizabeth decided to move to Paisley to further his career and hopefully escaped the violence back in Beath. In 1766, Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton offered John a position as president and a professor at Princeton University, which was the College of New Jersey at the time. Elizabeth didn't want to leave her beloved Scotland, and so he declined the offer initially. But Mr. Stockton persuaded the pair into joining them. In 1768, John boarded a ship and moved his family to America. They crossed the ocean, and he took charge of the college in the new country, leaving behind him the respect of his community and his successful career. John quickly turned the college around by raising money to pay off debts, promoting a higher standard of curriculum, and ultimately boosting the school's attendance. With the revolution taking its toll on the college, John turned his attention to the issue then of independence. He warmly accepted an invitation to become a delegate to represent New Jersey. In 1776, he took his seat a few days previous to the 4th of July. During these few days, John notably said this to another gentleman who said that the time wasn't right for America to declare their independence. He said, "Sir, in my judgment, the country is not only ripe, but rotting for the want of it." John was able to join with the rest of the delegates in signing the Declaration on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of 54. Having proven his worth to his constituents, John went on to represent New Jersey for 7 years. In 1792, John suffered eye injuries and he lost his sight entirely. With this and other ailments plaguing his health, John persevered with patience, and with a good, upbeat attitude, he didn't let these things hold him back. And he continued in his duties at the college and at the church until his death on November 15th, 1794, at the age of 72. John never spoke a word until he had settled the idea on the subject. He would then present these ideas with clarity and with power. His speeches were usually written in secret and perfectly memorized. He could repeat a sermon or a speech verbatim by simply reading it 3 times. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of John Witherspoon. In his person, Dr. Witherspoon was remarkably dignified. He was 6 feet in height and of fine proportion. He was distinguished for a fervent piety and for great punctuality and exactness in his devotional exercises. He spent a great deal of attention to the young people. He would impart the most useful advice to them, and this was always done with so much kindness that they would listen attentively to what it was he said and would remember his advice. Another interesting trait, besides his daily devotions of the closet, meaning his daily prayers, and his family, was the practice that the family observed on the last day of every year, using that day as a day of fasting, humility, and prayer. Now that is an excellent way to end the year. America's earliest surviving secular composition is My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free, written by Francis Hopkinson in 1759.
Francis Hopkinson.
Francis Hopkinson.
Francis Hopkinson.
Francis Hopkinson was born October 2nd, 1737 in Philadelphia. His father was a very good friend of Benjamin Franklin, as they had similar tastes and similar philosophies. Unfortunately, Francis's father died when he was just 14 years old, leaving only Francis's mother to raise the family. But Mrs. Hopkinson was a very smart lady and well qualified to educate her children. She decided to make every sacrifice and do everything within her power to give him a good education. Her income was limited, but she was able to get what she needed. Mrs. Hopkinson was an excellent example to her children, and her efforts were rewarded with success. She lived to see Francis graduate and become a prominent lawyer. Francis was a very talented man, and he stood out among his peers for his intellect. He had a talent for understanding the depths of science almost effortlessly. But he also excelled in music and poetry and dabbled a little bit in painting. In 1766, Francis left for England in an attempt to establish himself as a commissioner for customs for America. After about 2 years in London, he returned back home without having received that appointment to his dream job. But he quickly laid down his roots, and he got married to Anne Borden and settled in Philadelphia for a few years. Finally, his talents were noticed by the royal government, and he was offered his dream job in customs. But Francis found that he couldn't, in good conscience, accept the position, though, and chose to align himself with the Revolutionary Patriots by joining the Continental Congress in June of 1776, just in time for the important vote. Francis Hopkinson signed the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of 38. Shortly after the adoption of the Federalist Constitution, George Washington appointed Mr. Hopkinson to the office of Judge of the United States for the District of Pennsylvania. This was an important and a dignified station for which he was perfectly suited. He was particularly useful in rallying support during the Revolutionary War, and the main way that he accomplished this was with his pamphlets and essays written with satire and art and poetry and music, which were all very skillfully created. These works made Francis quite popular in his day, and they still remain quite enjoyable even today. His poetic writings were meant to be amusing to the reader, and they were all pretty popular throughout the colonies as well. His most popular one was The Battle of the Cakes, which taunts the British, and the next most popular one is one entitled A Pretty Story, which examines the relationship between Britain and the colonies. Francis served in this role until his death May 9th, 1791, when he suffered from internal bleeding at the age of 53. Although his time may have been cut short, Francis's works still live on today. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Francis Hopkinson. In his stature, Mr. Hopkinson was below the common size. His countenance was extremely animated, though his features were small. In speech, he was fluent, and in his motions unusually quick. Few men were kinder in their dispositions or more benevolent in their lives. He was distinguished for his powers of taste and for his love and devotion to science. Let me tell you about the Battle of the Cakes. It was a propaganda ballad written by Francis Hopkinson describing an attempted attack on the British fleet in the harbor of Philadelphia on January 6, 1778, during the American Revolutionary War. These kegs themselves were filled with gunpowder and were released to float down the Delaware River. It was hoped that they would come in contact with the warships along the riverfront and explode as river mines. As the floating mines moved down the river, however, very few of them contacted the ships of the British Navy, because the British had hauled their ships into a position that protected them from floating river ice, and thus also protected them from these exploding kegs. Well, the operation did not achieve its strategic results, and the attack was ineffectual, but A+ for effort. John's time in the Continental Congress earned him the nickname Honest John Hart.
John Hart.
John Hart.
John Hart.
Honest John Hart was born in 1713 to a family of farmers and public officials in New England. The exact place and the date of his birth is unknown. In fact, much of John's life has been lost to history. But what is known of John, however, shows us just how wonderful of a man he was. After John inherited the family's 400+ acre estate following his father's death, John started his own family and was married to Deborah Scudder in 1741, and the pair of lovebirds went on to have 13 children together. In 1750, John started his political career when he was elected to the Hunterdon County Board of Chosen Freeholders, which basically is a council of wealthy landholders who help create policies for their county of New Jersey. He served here until 1771, when he was appointed to the Committee of Safety and the Committee of Correspondence, and eventually as a judge on the Court of Common Pleas. John was known for his wisdom, his stability, and his good judgment, which made him very popular. This, as well as John's previous experience in the local and state government, made him an excellent candidate for the 1776 Continental Congress. As the British became more and more oppressive to the colonies, John's distaste for them grew and grew. He particularly disliked the Stamp Act, but wasn't the type of a man to be overly outspoken about it. Nevertheless, John was able to contribute to the revolutionary cause by voting in favor of independence and signing the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of about 60. His time on this important committee earned him the nickname Honest John Hart. As the Revolutionary War took its toll on New Jersey late in 1776, John's family was forced from the family estate as the farm was raided by the British. John was on the run from his enemies for the next several years, but his wife Deborah got very sick during their travels and couldn't continue any further. In a heartbreaking turn of events, John was forced to leave his wife's deathbed as the British troops encroached upon the place where they were staying. John spent the next year on the run, never being able to rest, and often spending the night in the stable with the animals in case the British came unexpectedly. Finally, as the British were pushed out of New Jersey, John was able to return home, only to find that his family's estate was in shambles. And with his own health deteriorating very quickly, John was never able to restore it to its former glory. John suffered from kidney stones for 6 months, until his death in 1780 at the age of about 67. Although he never personally recovered from the effects of the Revolutionary War, he was able to live long enough to see the tides turn in their favor. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Honest John Hart. The personal appearance of Mr. Hart was uncommonly Interesting. In his form, he was straight and well proportioned. In stature, he was above the middling size, and when a young man was said to have been handsome. In his disposition, he was uncommonly mild and amiable. He was greatly beloved by his family and friends and highly respected by a large circle of acquaintances who often appealed to his wisdom and judgment in the settlement of their local affairs. In addition to this, he enjoyed the reputation of being a sincere and humble Christian. How would you like the word honest being put in front of your name? Now that is something to work for. Abraham knew which side he stood on. Personal considerations did not influence his decision, knowing full well that his wealth and personal safety were at risk.
Abraham Clark.
Abraham Clark.
Abraham Clark.
Abraham Clark was born on February 15, 1726, in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Abraham's father realized very early on that his son was a very smart boy, especially in math. And so the young father hired a tutor to teach his son surveying at a young age. And this allowed Abraham to earn a living in a good career and fund the education that he was pursuing in law. Coming from humble beginnings, Abraham was known for his pro bono legal advice that he would provide to those who couldn't afford a lawyer themselves, leading him to be known as the poor man's counselor. Abraham was able to find his wife, Sarah Hatfield, and get married in 1749. The pair would go on to have 10 children together, and they would all be raised on the family farm, just like Abraham was. Mr. Clark's love of study and his veracity, meaning his accuracy, and a habit of truthfulness of his character naturally made him quite popular. His opinion was valued and often sought out, even beyond his immediate circle of friends. He was called to fill many respectable offices, which he did excellent in all the duties which he performed. So he was very useful in the community in which he lived. Early in the Revolution, Abraham was appointed to the Committee of Public Safety and sometimes after was elected to the Continental Congress. A few days before he took his seat for the first time, he was asked to vote for or against independence. But Abraham knew which side that he was on. Personal considerations did not influence his decision. He knew full well that his wealth and his personal safety were at risk. But the honor and the liberty of his country were more important. He voted for and he signed the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of 50. In 1787, Abraham was elected a member of the General Convention, which framed the Constitution. But due to his poor health, he wasn't able to be as involved in the discussions as he wanted to be. He had some serious concerns about the original draft of the Constitution, but these concerns were addressed with the amendments. He was elected a representative in the Second Congress under the Federal Constitution, an appointment which he continued to hold until a short time previous to his death. In June of 1794, with the close of his final term in public office, Abraham retired from public life. But he wasn't able to enjoy his retirement for too long, since in the autumn of the same year he suffered from heat stroke, which ultimately led to his death on September 15th, 1794, at the age of 68. Charles Augustus Goodrich recorded the headstone inscription of Abraham Clark. Firm and decided as a patriot, zealous and faithful as a friend to the public, he loved his country and adhered to her cause in the darkest hours of her struggles against oppression. Firm and decided. Now that's the goal. Decide where you want to stand and then be firm with your choice. Now he's a good example, and that's my goal, to decide and then be firm with my decisions. Stephen Hopkins was notably exceptional in his beautiful penmanship, but his signature stands out from the rest for the noticeable shake that he experienced while signing. He said about the moment he signed, quote, "My hand trembles, my heart does not."
Stephen Hopkins.
Stephen Hopkins.
Stephen Hopkins.
Stephen Hopkins was born on March 7, 1707 in present-day Scituate, Rhode Island. Though his childhood education was limited in comparison to his peers, Stephen was notably exceptional for his penmanship as well as in math, which allowed him to be an excellent surveyor. Since his talents couldn't be contained into just one profession, Stephen went into business as a farmer and a surveyor after he finished with his formal education. As a man of great intelligence, it's no surprise that Stephen would find a wife very early in his life. He was able to marry Sarah Scott in 1726, and the pair would go on to have 7 children before Sarah passed away. Stephen was then married to Anne Smith, and although they never had any children together, the pair were just as strong as any other. In 1730, Stephen got started in his political career close to home in his local government, serving as Justice of the Peace, then as a clerk in his hometown, then as Justice of the Inferior Court, as well as numerous other positions concurrently with his other duties. In 1751, Stephen was elevated to Chief Justice of Rhode Island Supreme Court, where he served for 2 consecutive terms, after which he was reelected as governor of Rhode Island. He served in this role on and off until 1768. In 1774, Stephen was elected as one of only 2 representatives from Rhode Island for the Continental Congress. After much deliberation and debate, Stephen was finally able to sign the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776 at the age of 69. But Stephen's signature stands out from the rest for the noticeable shake he was experienced while signing. Now, previously, we stated that Stephen was notably exceptional in his beautiful penmanship, but his shaking wasn't due to any fear or any internal conflict. Stephen was suffering from palsy in his hands at this point in his life. He said about the moment that he signed, quote, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not," unquote. Stephen resigned from the Congress shortly after his signature to the Declaration of Independence. To tend to his own failing health, he served for several more years back home in Rhode Island as a member of the General Assembly until 1779, at which point he finally retired from public service to spend the remainder of his days at home with his family. He was fortunate enough to have enjoyed this time for about 6 years until the 13th of July, 1785, when he finally passed away at the age of 78. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of Stephen, "He delighted in literature and science. He was attentive to books and a close observer of mankind. Thus, he went on improving until the period of his death. As a public speaker, he was always clear, precise, pertinent, and powerful." I want to be just like Stephen Hopkins. I also love observing people. People can teach you so many things, and people taught him to be precise and powerful, just like his great big good heart that was so firm at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. William died all curled up in his favorite chair, studying a book written in Latin, truly in the happiest place he could have been.
William Ellery.
William Ellery.
William Ellery.
William Ellery was born on December 22nd, 1727 in Newport, Rhode Island. William's father was a Harvard graduate working as a merchant, and he taught his young William right by his side throughout his entire childhood, encouraging his mind to explore the things that he was the most passionate about. William followed in his father's footsteps and graduated from Harvard in 1747, studying Greek and Latin, and then returning home to set up shop as a merchant before transitioning over into customs. While working in Newport, William began furthering his Harvard education by pursuing a new career path as a lawyer. In 1770, William finally opened his law practice, at which point he became more and more involved in his local politics. As a strong advocate for American independence, William found himself in opposition to the British rule, but wasn't able to find an outlet for his passions. When one of Rhode Island's representatives in the Continental Congress died in 1776, William saw his opportunity to serve his nation. He was then elected to fill the vacancy in the Congress and took his seat in May of 1776. William was an influential member of the Congress and took an active role in the important discussions that took place that summer. On the 4th of July, 1776, William Ellery signed the Declaration of Independence at the age of 48. In the following years, William continued his useful service to his young nation. In 1777, he offered Rhode Island as the place to organize and dispatch the Navy's fleet of fire ships, which are vessels specifically designed to be set ablaze to deter any oncoming enemy attack. Despite being the hub for this defense force, Rhode Island was still fell to the British shortly thereafter. During Rhode Island's time of occupation, William's home, as well as most of his property, were all burned up, leaving him without anywhere to go when the war was over. Though we don't know if William rebuilt on the very same property or moved somewhere else, we do know that he remained in Rhode Island. In 1785, William retired from his state's representation, and he began a very short career as Chief Justice of Rhode Island Supreme Court. And just 1 year later, George Washington appointed William to be the Collector of Customs for the town of Newport. This new position ended up being the last role that William would ever hold in his life. William served in this role for 35 years until his death, February 15, 1820, at the age of 92. And William died, curled up in his favorite chair, studying a book written in Latin, truly in the happiest place he could have been. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of William's character, "Indeed, the character of Mr. Ellery was much to be admired. He was indeed thought by some to have been too tenacious of his opinion, and not always free from asperity to others. But the years mellowed down these unpleasant traits of his character, and showed that he had exercised a watchfulness over himself, not entirely in vain. He manifested an uncommon disregard for the applause of men. It was often upon his lips, humility, rather than pride, become such creatures as we are." Mr. Ellery was truly a passionate person, and I can relate to that because I too am very passionate in my opinions, and I stand up for what I believe in. That must be why I love these founding fathers so much.